In this demo, we're going to learn how to use the Virtual Machine Role authoring tool to author a Linux-based resource definition package. Now, the demo does presuppose that you're already familiar with concepts like resource definitions, resource extensions, and view definitions, so we're not going to drill deeply into all the details of those items, but we are going to use this opportunity to show you how easy it is to create those types of artifacts with the Virtual Machine Role authoring tool. So to get started, I click File, and choose New Resource Definition Package. I have to provide a name for the package. I'm going to call it Linux Demo, and a folder in which I want the output of the tool to be placed, including the resource definition package itself, as well as any associated artifacts. After clicking OK, the tool goes ahead and gives me a resource definition package here. It's pre-populated the name that I specified. It's also auto-generated a version for me and pre-populated a publisher. In this case, I'll leave the name and version, and I'll go ahead and modify the publisher field. Extension references will be covered in a later demo, so we'll move on to the parameters section. You can see I have a number of parameters that have already been generated by the tool, and parameters are used during the deployment process to elicit end-user input. So in this case, the end user can provide the VM role virtual machine size that they want to create. They can select an OS virtual hard disk image. They can supply the admin credential, in this case the default root account credential within the Linux VM role. In the Scale Out tab, you can see that for initial, maximum, and minimum instance count, the tool's gone ahead and hard-coded some suggested values of 1, 5, and 1 respectively, and also provided a value of 1 for the upgrade domain count. Because these values are specified explicitly, the end user is not going to have the opportunity to choose any of these. These are just going to be hard-coded into the definition package. I'm going to leave the maximum, minimum, and upgrade domain counts hard-coded within the package, but I'm going to allow the end user to choose the initial instance count when they go ahead and deploy. Maybe they want to deploy 2 instances at deployment time. And to do that, the tool gives me a really easy option to generate a new parameter. And this allows you to also see the parameter format. Format of a parameter within a resource definition, really within a resource extension as well, is opening bracket, param dot, a friendly internal name of the parameter, and a closing bracket. Now, through the use of the view definition, we'll be able to provide a user-friendly name and description, as well as required messages and so forth for this parameter, and we'll get to that later when we get down to the view definition section. You can also see that the parameters have been updated by me adding a new parameter. The tool is smart enough to go ahead and update the parameters that are available within the resource definition at this particular point in time. Based on where I used that parameter, it's also taken a stab at guessing what is the type of the parameter. And because this was an instant count, it did guess or presume correctly that it's a type int. Moving on to the hardware profile, the hardware profile is really just about allowing the end user to select the size of the VM that they want to deploy when they go ahead and deploy this particular gallery item. I could certainly hard code a particular size in here, but I want the end user to have some flexibility to deploy small, medium, or large instances, so I'll leave this as a parameter choice. The storage profile is all about virtual hard disk images that might be used by the gallery item during deployment. Again, I could hard code something in here, and in this case it would be the family name and release values of that VHD in my VMM library. So if I had a Linux VHD in my library that I wanted this gallery item to use, and I didn't want the end user to have to choose it, I could simply put in the family name and release of that VHD in my VMM library, and now the end user will not be prompted to select a virtual hard disk image. Rather, the deployment process will automatically use the VHD in the VMM library to which this user has access that has the family name CentOS and the release value of 1.0.0.0. I don't want to hard code the virtual hard disk image, so I'm going to go back and select that this be parameterized for the end user to choose. I can do the same thing for data disks. If I wanted this gallery item to make available 1 or 2 data disks, I can simply click the Insert button, and I can either hard code a family and release that might exist in VMM, as well as the LUN that I want the user to use, or I could have the tool generate parameters for me and allow the end user to specify these options at deployment time. I'm not going to include any data disks for this demo, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those two. And I can, at any time during the authoring process, click the Validate button, and the tool will go ahead and give me warnings or errors based on fields that I might have missed or mismatches that I may have put in place through the authoring process. We can see here that I haven't provided any icons, but we're going to go ahead and provide those once we get down to the view definition section. A network profile contains one or more network adapters that the VM role will use and have access to at deployment time. The tool automatically generates a default network adapter of NIC1 for me and fills in some sensible defaults. You'll notice that the network reference is parameterized by default, and what this means is the end user will be able to select the VM network to which they want to deploy this VM at deployment time. So any networks that have been made available in the plan to which they are subscribed will show up in that drop-down at deployment time. I could, again, hard code a network reference here, but I'm going to leave it parameterized, and I'm going to leave all the other defaults. Although if I needed to do things like IPv6 configuration, I could certainly do that here, as well as load balancer configuration. Moving on to the operating system profile, this tab is used to configure what types of customization options are required for this particular gallery item during deployment. The default choice here is Windows, and you can see that because it's Windows and workgroup, I have workgroup fields here and a default parameter for the workgroup name. And if I switch to Linux, you'll notice that domain join credentials, and workgroup all get grayed out because those aren't applicable to a Linux resource definition. So when I select Linux, what I do get made available to me, though, is the DNS domain name, as well as an SSH public key that I may want to allow the end user to provide so that they can connect to their instance via PuTTY, for example. I don't want to hard code any of these values, so I'll have the tool generate some new parameters for me, one for the DNS domain name, and one for the SSH public key. And again, the parameters have been updated here to show that, number one, the workgroup parameter is no longer present because we removed it, but the DNS domain name and SSH public key parameters that I added are present here. So the tool, once again, has made sure that the parameters specified here are in sync with parameters that I've used in other parts of the model. So moving on to the view definition, you'll notice that we had these 3 warnings about missing icons, and if I happen to be somewhere else in the tool and click Validate, I can double-click any of these messages, and they'll take me to the place in the model which is causing the validation to fail. Now, if for whatever reason you don't provide icon files for your gallery items, the Windows Azure Pack portal does have a default icon that will be used. In this case, I've actually pre-staged some icons for use in this demo. So I'm going to go ahead and add my 30 by 30, 60 by 60, and 120 by 120 icon. The tool will do validation that the icons you're adding are the size that are specified here in the field. And I'll just go ahead and add my 30 by 30, 60 by 60, and my 120 icons. And for each of them, I then click the Update button. And now those icons are going to be included in the generated resource definition package that is output by the tool. You'll also notice this format up here for label, publisher label, and description, the format being 2 curly brackets, a friendly internal name, and another 2 curly brackets. What this is telling the gallery item is that we're going to provide localized values for each of these properties here. And you can see that the tool by default adds a resources file for US English. And if I also wanted to provide values for Spanish, for example, I can come up to the Resources tab. I have a drop-down of available language codes. And if I navigated down to Spanish, for example, I can click the plus sign, and now I have a new resources file. And I could provide Spanish values for each of these labels, descriptions, and other parameter fields. And in my view definition, because I have 2 resource files added, I can decide which one is the default language code. And you'll notice that if I go back and remove the Spanish resource file, that the tool is smart enough to only allow me to choose US English now because it's the only resource file that I have. So everything looks good here in the view def, and we're going to move on to sections. Sections within the ViewDef essentially correspond to a single page in the deployment wizard. I have one section, and this section has one category. Categories are groupings of parameters within a particular page of the deployment wizard. So if I wanted to separate out the DNS domain name and SSH key parameters into a different group within this deployment section, what I would do is create a new category. You notice I've clicked on section, and when I click add, what's great is the tool, because it's context sensitive, knows that the only thing that makes sense to add underneath a section is a view definition category. Therefore, all the other options here are grayed out, and I'm not allowed to make a mistake, if you will. So I'll add a new category, and the tool automatically generates a localized variable for this category name. Now I want to know what this category name actually refers to when I'm providing values in my resources file. So I'm going to give it a more sensible name of DNS SSH category name. And from here, I can now choose which of my available parameters I want to add to that category. So I'll add the DNS domain name by clicking the plus sign, and I'll also select the SSH public key parameter, and likewise click the plus sign. Now I want to make sure that these are the right type, and DNS domain name I don't want to be a secure string. I just want it to be a normal string value. I want users to be able to see what they're entering here. I could provide a default value if I wanted to. I could even provide a default value and say that it's not configurable by the end user. But I'm going to leave it configurable by the end user. I'm not going to provide a default value. And I'm going to do the same for the SSH public key. I am not going to provide a default value. I'm going to leave it configurable, and I am going to say that these two are required. And I could even put in things like minimum length, maximum length, and do regex validation. So if I had a field that needed an email address, for example, I could validate that the input provided by the end user is a valid email address, or at least a valid format of an email address. So if I go back to my default category, we'll see what the tool's generated for me here. My VM role size, I'm not going to have a default value. For my admin credential, I also won't have a default value. Time zone, I'll put a default value of Pacific Standard Time. I'll say that this is required and is still configurable by the end user. The computer name pattern, because this is going to be a CentOS 6 based computer, I'm going to provide a default value here of CentOS 6 role, pound, 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 but I'll let the end user override that if they want. I will make it required. For the network reference, no default value. And for the instance count, I'll provide that default value of 1. I'll say that this is required. And because, if you remember, in my scale-out section, I have a hard-coded maximum instance count of 5, I don't want end users to supply a value of 6 or 7 at deployment time, because that's not going to work. So in my VM category section here, what I can do for that initial instance count is say, I need a minimum value of 1 and a maximum value of 5. And finally, my OS virtual hard disk image, I can constrain the virtual hard disks that the user can choose from by supplying image tags. Now these tags would have to be added to the VHD in VMM, and that's a PowerShell command line option only. And the tool also provides a set of recommended or suggested tags that can be used. If one tag that you want to use is not here, you can freeform type the tag, of course, but I'm going to go ahead and choose CentOS Linux 6 and click the plus sign. I also want the user to choose the virtual hard disk image earlier on in the page. So if I just collapse the details of each of these parameters to make this a little easier for you to see, I have these great arrow buttons on the side here that allow me to reorder the parameters in the UI essentially, so that when the user goes to deploy this item, the very first thing they're going to be asked for is the virtual machine role size. And after the size, I want them to then select the operating system disk. So I'm just going to go ahead and move the OS virtual hard disk image up in the order here by clicking this plus arrow, and I'm going to put it right above the admin credential. So now, when we go ahead and deploy this item, we're going to see that the user is first asked for the size, then to choose the hard disk image, then to provide the administrator credential, the time zone, the computer name pattern, the network, and finally the instance count. Then they'll be asked for the values of the parameters in this category, namely the DNS domain name and the SSH public key. Now, I'm going to move ahead to my resources file where I can provide a better end user experience by giving them friendlier text within the deployment wizard. So first thing I'll do, if you remember the view definition, the label of the gallery item is denoted by this friendly internal name of Linux demo label, and the description of the gallery item by this internal name Linux demo description. So in my resources file, for the Linux demo label, I'm going to say that this is a CentOS Linux VM role. And for the description, I can give a little bit longer text to explain to the end user what we're going to be deploying here. And I can even change my category names. So I'll say that that first category is really all about the virtual machine properties. And that second category that I added, remember, DNS SSH category name, is going to be for DNS domain name and SSH properties. And I can give friendly descriptions for each of those parameters as well. So I could say that we're going to call this DNS space domain space name. I could do the same thing for description, and I could provide a longer description if I wanted to, as well as the required message. So I'll say DNS domain name is a required parameter, and I'll show you in a few minutes how that shows up in the UI should the user forget to add the DNS domain name or forget to specify the value for that particular parameter. The same thing here for the SSH key. We're just going to make it a little friendlier to read in the deployment UI. And we'll just do the label here. And if for whatever reason I wanted a different publisher to show up, I could modify that here. But the tool's gone ahead and added the publisher that I specified here as the value of the publisher in the resources file. So I added my icons, and if I revalidate, you can see that we have 0 errors and 0 warnings. So everything looks pretty good here. I'm going to go ahead and save the resource definition. And if I switch over to the working folder that I've been using, you can see that the tool's gone ahead and generated a resource definition package and also a working folder underneath that has all of the raw artifacts that are actually part of that package, including the resources file itself. So I can get a good idea, a good sense of all the artifacts that the tool's been generating, and I could also open them up and view them if I wanted to. Which leads me to one other thing that I wanted to show in the tool before we switch over and get this item imported into the Windows Azure Pack portal and go through a deployment experience. The fact that for each of the artifacts in the tool, the resource definition, the view definition, and if I had a resource extension for that artifact as well, we give you a nice pretty printed JSON view of exactly what the tool is generating. So this is my view definition, and I can scroll through and see the actual JSON that's been generated by the tool, and I can do the same thing for my resource definition. And I can see the JSON that's been generated by the tool. This is a read-only view, but it does give you a good sense of what the tool is creating behind the scenes. So I'll switch back to the editor, and what we're going to do now is close this resource definition. The tool asked me one more time, hey, do you want to save this? That's fine. I'll save it one more time, and we'll go ahead and get this imported into the Windows Azure Pack. So I'm logged in to my Service Administrator portal within the Windows Azure Pack, and I'm on the VM Clouds tab. And you can see I have a number of items that are available to me up at the top menu, and the last one on the far right is the gallery. So from here, I can import new gallery items. I click the Import button at the bottom of the screen. I can browse for the location of my package. This is the Linux demo ResDef package that we just created. I click the checkbox, and you'll see that the gallery item has been imported. And if I go over to the second page of my gallery, or back to the first page of my gallery, you'll see that we have a CentOS Linux VM role with me as the publisher, the right version, and the import date, which is just now. I can now go ahead and make this gallery item public so that end users can view it and use it. And I can also then assign it to plans by clicking the Plans node up at the top. I'm going to add it to a plan that I have available called Demo Plan. Click the checkbox, and the tool tells me that Linux VM role was successfully added to the plan, and it might take a little bit of time for the plan to which the item has been added to appear. I find that it's generally pretty fast, so what we're going to do is switch over to the tenant experience in the portal. I'll just go ahead and refresh the page here. I'm signed in as a demo user that I created earlier and gave access to this demo plan. I haven't created anything, but if I click New, Virtual Machine Role from Gallery, you'll notice that I have two options available to me. A Windows Server 2012 gallery item, which I created in a different video demo, and the new CentOS Linux VM role that we just created. If I click Next, I provide a name for the VM role that I want to deploy. And now you'll see all the options that we specified in the tool. First, the user chooses the size. They choose an operating system disk. There's only one disk in my VMM system that matches, so I leave that. Remember, we moved the administrator credential up, or the disk up, so it is above the administrator credential. I supply a password for my default root account. I can choose a different time zone or leave Pacific time. I'll just go ahead and leave Pacific time. Remember, we provided this default value, but if I didn't like that, I can provide my own value as an end user. I can choose the network to which I want to deploy. I can override the default initial instance count. I can provide DNS domain name and the SSH public key. And from there, I could click Check to go ahead and deploy. I'm not going to deploy as part of this demo, but you have seen how to easily create a Linux-based resource definition, import it into the Windows Azure portal, and make it available to one or more plans. Thank you very much.